They laughed when she applied for a night shift security job at the local tech hub, mocking her quiet demeanor and small frame. But the smirks faded when federal agents stormed the building just days later, not with accusations but with questions about the ink that ran down her spine like a hidden code. What had seemed like a joke to everyone else became a turning point for the country's top intelligence agency, and for her, a long-buried past was about to resurface in the most unexpected way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Few people noticed her when she walked into the Hightower Solutions security office that Tuesday morning. She was dressed in a plain black hoodie, worn jeans, and faded sneakers, with her auburn hair tucked neatly under a navy cap. To the receptionist, she looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on her way to the back alley, but Camila Rios knew exactly where she was going. She handed in her resume quietly, without fanfare, without even the usual flustered apologies applicants often carried with them like baggage. No one expected her to make it past the waiting room. The guy next to her, bulked up from gym hours and loud about his 3 years in private security, scoffed the moment she sat down. The others followed suit, chuckling under their breath as she signed her name and took a seat in the far corner, away from the light. But Camila wasn't here to prove anything to them. She wasn't here for ego or pride. In fact, she hoped to be invisible, to be just another nameless body filling a night shift schedule. That was the plan. Lay low. Breathe. Survive. She hadn't applied for anything in over 3 years, not since she disappeared from public records after a classified operation went sideways overseas. She had lived off the grid since then, moving through small towns, keeping her head down, doing cash jobs, sleeping in shelters, and staying far from anything that might trigger an alert or a memory she wasn't ready to face. But something about this town, Ridgemont Heights, felt tolerable. The population was small, the rent was barely affordable, and the job required minimal interaction. It was perfect. Her resume was intentionally dull. Former intern at a city records office. Volunteer at a community library. Basic training in self-defense. Nothing remarkable. She didn't list the foreign languages she spoke fluently, the military-grade firearms she could disassemble and reassemble blindfolded, or the cyber defense protocols she'd written during her years in the field. Those belonged to another identity, one buried under layers of protective silence and bureaucratic erasure. The tattoo down her spine wasn't even visible, tucked beneath her sweater and inked so subtly it appeared like decorative symbols to the untrained eye. But the ones who knew what it meant, the ones who had once built entire networks around its encryption, would recognize it instantly. The man who interviewed her was polite but dismissive. He asked a few routine questions about availability and conflict resolution, then paused at her application. "You don't have any formal security certifications," he pointed out, eyebrows raised, pen tapping against the desk in that mildly patronizing way that people used when they were about to reject you gently. Camila only nodded. "I can handle myself," she said softly. He chuckled, not cruelly, just skeptically. She was 5'5" at most, weighed maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, and had the kind of calm voice that sounded more suited to meditation classes than late-night patrols through industrial complexes. Still, the position was understaffed, and she offered to start immediately with no benefits, no questions, and no fuss. They hired her on the spot. Her first shift was uneventful. She walked the perimeter, logged her rounds, checked the server room locks, and kept to herself. Cameras followed her, but didn't register anything unusual. The other guards barely acknowledged her, assuming she wouldn't last a week. She didn't talk, didn't smoke during breaks, didn't eat from the vending machine. She just moved, precise and quiet, like a ghost floating through steel corridors. And then came the night of the storm. The power flickered. The backup grid kicked in. A minor glitch triggered a system diagnostic, that rerouted data logs to an external agency by mistake, a dormant failsafe buried deep within the original security architecture, something that hadn't been touched since Hightower Solutions was still contracted by the Department of Defense for cyber encryption development. The data packet included camera snapshots from the past week. One frame caught Camila walking down the hall, mid-turn, hoodie hiked slightly as she reached for her flashlight. It was enough to reveal a portion of the ink on her back, a clean, vertical line of runes, shapes, and dots that to the casual observer looked artistic. But to the FBI, it looked like a cipher, not just any cipher. The Blackthorn cipher, a now-defunct operative signature believed to have been eliminated in a covert operation years ago. The symbol was restricted, sealed in classified files, and known only to those in high-clearance intel circles. Within 12 hours, Ridgemont Heights found itself hosting a black SUV with unmarked plates parked 2 blocks from the security office. 3 agents in plain clothes walked in mid-shift, bypassing protocol, and asked to speak with Camila Rios. She didn't run. She didn't ask why. She simply looked up from her monitor, removed her earpiece, and calmly said, "You're late." And with that, the game changed. Those who had laughed now watched in stunned silence as federal agents escorted her not in handcuffs, but with caution and respect, asking her questions in tones reserved for people who mattered more than anyone had guessed. For Camila, the hiding was over, and for the world, the story was just beginning. Camila Rios didn't look like someone who had once helped dismantle an underground weapons network in Eastern Europe or mapped secure communication nodes deep in the border towns of Southeast Asia. She looked like someone who spent most of her time in libraries and back alleys, with a soft, deliberate walk that made her appear unhurried, unimportant, even invisible. That invisibility had been her most valuable weapon for years. It was hard-earned, honed over time by necessity rather than training. Her face, while striking in the right light, bore no distinctive features. Medium brown eyes, pale olive skin, a slender jawline often hidden beneath a hood. She spoke softly, never loudly, and rarely initiated conversations. People usually forgot her within minutes. That was exactly the point. Her apartment was barely more than a converted studio tucked behind an old boxing gym in Ridgemont Heights. The windows were frosted with grime, and the heater clicked rhythmically, like a metronome with a cough. She didn't decorate the walls or bring in furniture beyond the essentials. A mattress on the floor, a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes, a laptop she didn't connect to the internet, and a black steel lockbox under the sink that she hadn't opened in months. Every item she owned could be packed and carried in less than 10 minutes, a ritual she repeated in her mind every few nights to remind herself she could still vanish if she needed to. She woke early, even on her off days, her body trained by years of uncertain environments where dawn was the only safe window. Her routines were tight, deliberate, and rehearsed. Wake, shower, stretch, scan the exterior, journal a brief summary of the past 24 hours. Not emotions, just facts. Time slept, meals eaten, interactions, surveillance signs, anything unusual. It was the habit of someone whose past had never let her fully relax, even when the threat had supposedly ended. She kept her phone turned off and buried in her sock drawer, checking it once every 3 days, only to delete spam messages and confirm the time. The name Camila Rios wasn't her birth name. That identity was long gone, wiped clean during the fall of Operation Kalanich, an intelligence initiative that had begun as a reconnaissance project in the Middle East and had spiraled into something darker. She had been part of the logistics crew at first, managing encrypted intel between ground units and remote analysts. But her capacity to see patterns where others saw noise had earned her fast promotions. She became the go-to silent fixer, the one they brought in when an asset had vanished, or when codes weren't breaking, or when a local informant had turned up dead, and someone needed to parse loyalty from betrayal in under an hour. She was good, Too good. And that was what got her noticed by the wrong people. When Kalinich collapsed, the agents scattered. Some were absorbed back into other departments. Others disappeared, officially listed as KIA, or reassigned. Camila chose exile. Not because she was guilty, but because she was tired. Tired of being the tool other people used to dig into dangerous places. Tired of constantly looking over her shoulder. Tired of serving a mission whose cost kept rising with no guarantee of justice. She'd faked her own deactivation, slipped through a bureaucratic loophole, planted the necessary data leaks, left traces of a final operation gone wrong in Algeria, and buried herself in the anonymity of the American interior. For nearly 4 years, no one looked for her. Not officially. Not aggressively. It helped that Kalinites had been swept under layers of denials and classified audits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In Ridgemont Heights, she became a ghost of her former self. She picked the town carefully. Small enough to avoid big government eyes, but big enough to provide infrastructure and low-profile job opportunities. She worked as a dishwasher under an assumed name. She volunteered at a shelter without using her real address. She kept to alleys, thrift shops, and the forgotten edges of the community. When her funds ran dry, she applied to Hightower Solutions only because it promised nights, solitude, and silence. The tattoo on her spine was the only thing she carried from her old life. Not out of sentiment but necessity. It wasn't just ink. It was encryption. A cipher embedded in her flesh, designed by a friend who died protecting the last safe transmission Kalinites ever sent. It was dormant, unreadable to anyone but a specific subset of scanners, but it still lived beneath her skin like a dormant seed. She'd considered removing it. She'd tried, even. But every time she reached the threshold of action, something inside her whispered, "Not yet." Despite her desire for invisibility, Camila had a sharp mind that never truly rested. She watched people, their posture, their eyes, their rhythms. She studied the architecture of buildings, not for beauty, but for exits, blind spots, and sound patterns. She still kept maps of the city, marking utility lines and dead zones in cell reception. Not because she planned to use them, but because it was what her brain defaulted to. Some skills never leave you, even if you've buried them under quiet jobs and lonely dinners. Her instincts hadn't dulled, only softened around the edges. People who passed her on the street saw a woman in her late 20s who wore layers in summer and avoided eye contact. They didn't see the former analyst who once helped prevent a targeted bombing on an embassy, using only a broken transmission and a 3-hour window. They didn't see the woman who once walked through an ambush barefoot, carrying an injured translator across 20 kilometers of hostile terrain. They just saw a quiet girl with no resume, worth noting. And that was the point. That was her protection. But something had shifted in her the moment she accepted the job at Hightower. A part of her, perhaps without permission, had begun to surface again. Not out of ego or vengeance, but because the world had changed while she was gone, and she could feel it in the air, the way some animals sense earthquakes before they hit. She didn't know yet that her reappearance had triggered dormant surveillance tags. She didn't know that her tattoo had been flagged by accident, or that a ghost file buried in the FBI's deep archives had suddenly pinged to life. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, her sleep was light, her mind unsettled, and her past felt like it was walking half a step behind her, waiting. Camila Rios was no longer hiding. She just hadn't realized it yet. Ridgemont Heights sat somewhere between forgotten and quietly functional. A town tucked in the valleys of the Pacific Northwest, it was surrounded by low forest ridges and thin creeks that twisted like nervous fingers through the outskirts. Fog settled early here, especially in the fall, stretching across the streets before dawn and clinging to the corners of buildings like something alive. On most maps, Ridgemont was barely a dot, a former logging town that tried and failed to reinvent itself during the software boom of the 2000s. The big promises had come and gone. Left in their place were skeletons of tech dreams. half-finished industrial parks, converted warehouses turned co-working spaces, and a downtown strip populated by vape shops, an organic cafe that always seemed empty, and a bank that had changed names 3 times in a single year. Camila lived in a converted utilities shed above the boxing gym on Crescent Street. The gym had belonged to a retired Marine who ran training camps for troubled youth during the summer and spent the rest of the year arguing politics with the barber next door. No one asked questions in this part of town. Rent was paid in cash, and neighbors came and went with the seasons. Across the street was a shuttered laundromat with graffiti tags that hadn't changed in over a year. A Vietnamese restaurant on the corner stayed open past midnight but only served locals who knew to knock twice. In this environment, Camila thrived. Not socially, but invisibly. It was the kind of town where no one looked twice at someone quiet. And no one ever called the cops unless there was blood or fire. Hightower Solutions had chosen Ridgemont Heights for the same reasons Camila had: cheap land, low regulation, quiet enough to work without scrutiny. The company's headquarters were located in the far end of the Old Commerce District, where roads cracked like dry skin and feral cats moved like shadows beneath chain-link fences. From the outside, the facility looked unremarkable: 3 connected structures with mirrored windows and faded security signs that warned against trespassing in 3 languages. But inside, it was a maze of halls, server rooms, digital labs, and secure vaults, many of which hadn't been touched in years. Most people thought Hightower was just another regional logistics provider, specializing in network administration and digital billing systems. But Camila knew better. In its prime, Hightower had been a subcontractor for larger defense firms, ones that needed quick prototype development in encrypted communication systems without drawing attention to themselves. Hightower had provided infrastructure for covert operations, intelligence-gathering software, and systems integration for satellite signal relays. But those days had ended when federal oversight tightened and contracts dried up. The newer leadership pivoted into civilian contracts, but the architecture, the skeleton of Hightower's darker past, remained buried in the walls. Camila saw it the moment she walked the corridors her first night on the job. The sensors were too precise. The keypad entry systems were from a vendor she recognized from her prior work. The access logs were still running on a redundant ghost server, something no casual IT admin would bother maintaining unless they were covering up prior usage. She patrolled the north wing mostly, an older section filled with defunct lab spaces and shuttered offices. Her flashlight flickered across long, dormant terminals, and filing cabinets bolted shut. Every door she passed had a story she could nearly reconstruct. She could sense where soundproofing had once been installed, where false ceilings might hide wiring conduits, where air vents weren't designed for airflow but surveillance devices. It was like walking through the faded memories of a life she had tried to forget, one where everything felt 2 steps ahead of catastrophe, where danger hummed just beneath the hum of servers. The other guards didn't notice these things. Most of them were locals looking for stable pay. They walked their rounds with earbuds in, more concerned about TikTok notifications than perimeter breaches. The lead guard, Mickey, was a former sheriff's deputy with a limp and a superiority complex. He ran the floor like a king, whose court barely tolerated him, enforcing trivial protocols like badge placement and lunchroom etiquette. He had no idea what half the facility even did. The cameras were outdated. The facial recognition software hadn't been patched in months. Even the panic system was routed through an emergency line that, unbeknownst to most, no longer connected to any active federal node. Camila noticed it all but said nothing. She didn't want attention, but she memorized the wiring layouts, updated floor schematics in a notebook she kept hidden behind the boiler room, and walked every shift like she was preparing for a breach that would never come. Because, in her experience, it always did. You didn't survive Kalaniche without developing an ear for incoming storms. And Ridgemont, for all its surface stillness, felt pregnant with unease, like something waiting to be triggered. The social dynamics were equally predictable. At the diner 2 blocks from the security office, The waitresses rotated gossip between petty crime stories and dating rumors. At the hardware store, retired men gathered every Saturday to swap stories about their glory days, occasionally glancing at Camila when she passed by like she didn't belong, but wasn't worth questioning. She knew their types: men who didn't like questions they couldn't answer, women who could sense secrets but chose politeness instead of curiosity. Even at the local grocery store, she felt eyes on her, not hostile, just uncertain. People couldn't place her. That made them nervous. That made her vulnerable. She adjusted her patterns accordingly. Yet, in all this quiet watchfulness, the town seemed oblivious to what it was sitting on. Beneath the cracked sidewalks and moss-covered rooftops, old data pipelines still ran, legacy server networks still blinked in the basements of shuttered buildings, and buried inside one of Hightower's cold storage vaults was a single backup drive that still bore the name of a mission-long classified, Blackthorn/GR07. Camila didn't know that the storm had already begun the moment she scanned her ID badge on her first night. But Ridgemont Heights, quiet, sleepy, and forgotten, was about to be reminded of its past. And in the process, the woman they all ignored would become the most important person they never saw coming. The first sign of the storm wasn't the black SUV or the agents in press jackets. It came in the form of an automated email, an innocuous system anomaly report sent from a long-dormant firewall node deep in the Hightower network. The report was generated at 2:17 a.m. and flagged to a now deactivated inbox once belonging to the Department of Strategic Asset Monitoring, a subdivision of the Intelligence Oversight Bureau that no longer publicly existed. The system, written in part by Camila years ago under a different name and ID, was designed to self-trigger if encrypted biometric markers were detected within the facility. It had never fired before, but now it had. And that single automated ping, bouncing through back-channel IPs and abandoned government shells, lit a fuse in a network that should have been dead. At the end of that fuse sat a man named Barrett Klein, though the name was only partially his. Klein had made a career of moving sideways through the intelligence world, never rising high enough to draw public attention, but never low enough to be disposable. He was the kind of man who thrived in gray zones, in interagency disputes, and in the bureaucratic fog between clearance levels. His official title was Director of Compliance for Federal Cyber Defense, but in practice, he was the gatekeeper for anything that risked exposure to the public or to foreign entities. Blackthorn was his ghost. He'd overseen its final years, not as its architect, but as its cleaner. The man brought in to sanitize files, repurpose remaining tech, and quietly eliminate rogue assets once the operation's usefulness had expired. Camila Rios was never meant to survive. When her biometric imprint triggered the firewall anomaly, Klein was awakened by a ping to his personal line, encrypted and encoded with 3 layers of redundancy. He didn't panic. He didn't even sit up. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water in the dark, opened a secure tablet, and scrolled through the metadata attached to the alert. There it was: Facility ID, Hightower Solutions, Employee Scan ID, CR Asset Tag, Inactive, Status, Ghost Ping. And then the confirmation code that turned the water in his glass to ash in his mouth: Cipher_07, tattoo signature on spinal sector confirmed. She was alive, and she was careless enough to walk through a scanner built by her own hand, or bold enough to walk into the light. Klein moved fast, but not recklessly. His strength was in subtlety. Within 12 hours, he had rerouted the alert through a redundant FBI intelligence branch known as DSAR, the Division for Surveillance and Asset Recovery. Publicly, they were an urban crime analytics unit. In reality, they specialized in locating and neutralizing dormant threats, assets like Camila, who had disappeared but were never formally deactivated. To the agents he dispatched, this was a ghost recovery. To Klein, it was a threat containment. Not because Camila was dangerous in the traditional sense, but because she remembered things that weren't meant to be remembered. Things buried in sealed rooms and encrypted systems. Things tied to a failed operation that, if resurrected, could embarrass people still in power. Camila wasn't just a risk. She was a living archive of something they had all sworn didn't exist. The antagonist in Camila's life had never been one person. It had always been the system, a tangled mesh of power and secrecy that consumed loyalty and discarded bodies when convenient. Klein was its face now, but only one of many over the years. What made him dangerous was his precision. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't lash out. He moved like poison, slow, invisible, and lethal. He initiated background probes into Camila's aliases, bank activity, and rental records. He requested satellite sweeps of Ridgemont's industrial district and accessed dormant feeds from the Hightower facility's external CCTV system. By the time Camila had clocked out from her third shift, Klein had already reconstructed her last 4 weeks of movement and identified 6 individuals who had interacted with her. He didn't send a strike team. That would attract attention. Instead, he authorized surveillance drones with facial tracking protocols. He ordered a quiet data scrape of her work terminal, flagged the Hightower firewall logs for deletion, and had a mid-level analyst reformat the remaining security footage to erase any trace of the tattoo's exposure. In Klein's mind, this was not a crisis yet. It was a cleanup, a correction. Camila had broken protocol by staying alive. Now she had triggered the one alarm he couldn't afford to ignore. Meanwhile, on the ground, the atmosphere in Ridgemont Heights began to shift in imperceptible ways. Unmarked vans appeared on side streets. Unfamiliar customers lingered too long in the diner across from the security office. A new maintenance worker arrived at Hightower, friendly, curious, always near the server room. To an untrained eye, these were just coincidences. But Camila's instincts caught the scent before logic had time to catch up. Something in the air had shifted. The silence had grown tighter, more watchful. She felt it in the way her shifts suddenly paired her with others when she had previously been left alone. In the way Mickey began asking seemingly innocuous questions. What year she graduated high school, if she had family nearby, what her plans were after her contract ended. Klein was already close. Not physically, but operationally. His team was triangulating her, watching her rhythm, waiting for the right moment. His goal wasn't confrontation. It was control. If he could predict her next move, he could neutralize the risk without exposure. Camila was a loose thread, and Klein was a man who prided himself on clean suits. The real problem wasn't her survival. It was what she might still carry, the data she might have memorized, the encryption keys embedded in her neural habits, the knowledge she might unknowingly activate under pressure. He couldn't afford to let her fall into the hands of anyone else. Not law enforcement, not foreign intelligence, not even whistleblowers. She was his problem, and soon he would deal with her, as he had dealt with others who strayed too far from their assigned fates. Back in her apartment, Camila still moved with the illusion of peace, but something inside her had begun to stir. Her past was no longer a closed door. It was a shadow lengthening on the wall, and the ones who once tried to erase her were now watching again, this time not from a distance, but from behind her own reflection. It started with the lights. The motion sensor fluorescents in Corridor 7B began flickering for no clear reason, always right before Camila reached them during her rounds. The tech crew blamed faulty wiring, but Camila knew better. The anomaly repeated itself every night, precisely at 1:36 a.m., as if someone, or something, were testing her movements, gauging her patterns. She noted it in her journal, marking the behavior alongside other irregularities, duplicate logs on her RFID badge scans, echoes in the internal comm system, timestamp mismatches in the door access reports. To anyone else, it would look like nothing. But to Camila, it was the return of a pattern, subtle probing layered inside routine. It was the same rhythm that preceded cleanups in Blackthorn, the slow drip of paranoia before everything collapsed. Every shift brought a new variation. Sometimes the security monitors in the northern wing would cut to static for 4 seconds. No more, no less. Other times, she would find her locker closed when she had left it open. the latch resting in just the wrong angle for it to be accidental. Files on the shared system vanished briefly, and then reappeared with slightly altered metadata. Most of the other guards chalked it up to system lag or poor IT oversight. Camila said nothing. She simply observed, adjusted, moved her rounds 2 minutes earlier, took alternate routes, shifted her access key from her left pocket to her right. Each change was logged in her head with surgical precision. The ritual had begun. Camila understood patterns more deeply than most. She knew how organizations behaved when they were watching someone. There were always layers. First, the passive probes, the soft data collection, the artificial mishaps meant to test reflexes. If the subject reacted too strongly, they were marked. If they didn't react at all, the system escalated to pressure. Camila gave them neither. She treated every shift like a rehearsal, maintaining her cover while silently preparing for extraction. She altered her walking rhythm on alternate nights, looped in unpredictable spirals through the facility, and paused without reason mid-corridor just to force the eye watching her to blink. And still, the invisible presence adjusted with her. That was what made it clear. It wasn't just random surveillance. Someone was reacting to her. And the pattern mirrored something she had encountered once in Istanbul, years ago, during Operation Cadence, a psychological test built into a surveillance node, designed to pressure double agents into exposing themselves through minor behavioral inconsistencies. The problem with the system was that it assumed the subject didn't know they were being tested. Camila did. And that changed everything. Meanwhile, the human aspect of her world remained dissonantly unchanged. Mickey continued his performative leadership, barking orders during briefings and micromanaging locker room conduct. He still viewed Camila as harmless, a mute presence who followed protocol and caused no drama. Yet even he began asking more questions, not always directly, sometimes through others. He'd send Danica, one of the senior guards, to casually probe Camila about her plans after security. He encouraged group patrols. He started rotating shift partners more frequently, making sure Camila never patrolled alone longer than 2 hours. These adjustments were framed as routine, in the name of team synergy. But Camila knew the signs. Mickey had been told something. Not everything, but enough to make him cautious, enough to turn him from dismissive to watchful. Outside of Hightower, the pattern bled into her personal life. Her usual route to the corner grocery store was detoured by street construction that hadn't been there the day before. Her favorite booth at the diner was always occupied now by unfamiliar faces who didn't order food, just coffee that never seemed to need refilling. The boxing gym below her apartment closed unexpectedly for renovations, even though the owner had just installed new flooring 2 weeks prior. Every part of her daily rhythm was being pushed, nudged off balance, not enough to trigger panic, but just enough to wear down the edges of her calm. It was death by disruption, a technique used in psychological containment operations. Familiarity breeds comfort. Disrupt it slowly, and the subject begins to unravel on their own. But Camila didn't unravel. She adapted. With every escalation, she refined her countermeasures. She placed a drop of clear nail polish over her locker's latch and checked it for cracks each morning to confirm tampering. She ran silent tests on her keycard to verify clone attempts. She began leaving harmless traps, placing her duffel bag at slightly shifted angles, sprinkling fine powder on the threshold of her door, arranging paper slips under her doormat that would crumple if disturbed. The results were conclusive. She was being tracked. Someone had entered her space while she was gone. Someone had touched her world without permission. And yet, Camila said nothing. She understood that to speak was to escalate. The moment she confronted anyone, Mickey, Danica, the Hightower admins, she'd be flagged. She'd lose the upper hand. Instead, she collected, waited, not just for confirmation of the pattern, but for the rupture. Every surveillance game had one. A moment when pressure became overreach, when the hand-watching grew greedy and revealed itself by mistake. She spent her days preparing for that crack in the pattern, reviewing floor plans, memorizing faces, studying shifts, collecting habits. Her world became data again, not out of fear, but purpose. The same part of her that once charted escape routes through collapsing embassies was now analyzing security schedules and supply room access logs. Her skills weren't dead. They had simply been dormant. Now they woke with the quiet precision of muscle memory returning to form. She didn't know yet whether Klein himself was close, but she could feel the shape of his influence, methodical, quiet, always 2 steps ahead and 1 behind. A rhythm designed to suffocate. But Camila wasn't suffocating. She was breathing differently now, measured, tactical. The ritual they thought would break her was only making her sharper. And the more the pattern repeated, the more she recognized its flaws. Because patterns, once exposed, can be disrupted. And Camila Rios had spent her whole life learning how to break systems from the inside out. The arrival of Thomas Arledge was not announced. No email, no staff memo, no formal introduction. One day he wasn't there, and the next, he was. Officially, he was assigned to Hightower as a systems auditor, a subcontractor brought in to assess the company's cybersecurity compliance, following a series of recent anomalies flagged in their network infrastructure. That's how Mickey introduced him. Leaning against the break room counter, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, he told the guards to stay out of the server room unless explicitly called, because the new IT guy's cleaning house. No one paid much attention. Consultants came and went at Hightower. They were usually forgettable, soft-spoken, data-obsessed, too absorbed in jargon to make a dent in the social order of the security staff. But Camila noticed him immediately. Not because he was loud or invasive, quite the opposite. It was the way he moved, observant but careful, never overstepping, but always watching with an attentiveness that mirrored her own. He walked with a slight hunch, as if trying to minimize his height, and wore glasses that didn't quite sit evenly on the bridge of his nose. His clothes were practical: gray jacket, button-down shirt, dark jeans, polished but unremarkable. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, and his silence didn't read as shyness. It read as calibration. He passed her twice in the hallway before he spoke. The first time, he nodded politely, eyes pausing just a fraction too long on her ID badge. The second time, he lingered near the security desk, under the pretense of checking the access logs. She watched his fingers hover over the terminal, not quite typing, just observing the interface. When he finally said her name, it was without preamble. Camila Rios, graveyard shift, North Wing. His voice was calm, low, without accusation. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. He wasn't looking for confirmation. He was observing her reaction. She gave him none. He continued casually, as if commenting on the weather. You logged a manual override on panel 12 3 nights ago. Door sensor failed. You reset it without reporting. That's not in protocol. Camila blinked, not because she was caught, but because someone had actually noticed. Panel 12 had been one of the deliberate tests she planted to confirm someone was monitoring her keystrokes. She'd expected the anomaly to trigger a report, but none had appeared on the system. That meant 2 things. 1. Someone had buried the alert before it hit official logs. 2. Someone with access to the shadow layer of the infrastructure had been watching even closer than she thought. She met his gaze then, just long enough to see what was behind it. Recognition. Not personal, not emotional, tactical. He knew she was more than she appeared. He might not have known exactly who she was, but he knew enough to look past the resume, past the uniform, past the silence. She had felt invisible for so long, even while being hunted. And now, in a hallway between locked doors and flickering overheads, someone had truly seen her. Thomas didn't press. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he shifted gears and let the silence do the rest. Over the next few days, he appeared more frequently, but always without disruption. He shared space with quiet respect. Once, he left a file folder on the security desk addressed to her. Inside was a single printed line of code, an obsolete script from a decommissioned surveillance subroutine once used by Kalanich during its final days. A breadcrumb. Nothing explicit. But Camila understood immediately. He wasn't just a contractor. He had either worked inside one of the branches she'd touched, or had access to a level of clearance buried deep in forgotten archives. He was reaching out, but carefully, testing her the way she had been testing the system. She responded the next night by rerouting one of her security loops to include a detour through the old subserver junction in the western wing, an area marked inactive but still running on minimal power. She made sure to leave a trace in the system, just enough to be picked up by anyone watching. Sure enough, Thomas passed through that same junction 20 minutes later, pausing by the terminal she'd modified. He didn't comment, didn't even glance at her as he left. But something shifted between them. An understanding. Camila didn't trust easily, but she trusted signs. And Thomas Arledge was moving like someone who understood how signs worked. He began dropping small things in her path. A modified maintenance schedule printed with unusual formatting, a declassified weather anomaly report pinned on the break room bulletin board, an out-of-place USB stick left beneath the charging station marked with a symbol only a former Blackthorn operative would recognize, a hollowed triangle within a circle. The kinds of signs meant to communicate without words, without risk. And she answered in kind. A redirected camera angle that now faced a dead zone. A line of coffee cups rearranged in an old informant signal pattern. No one else would notice. But he did. He became the first witness, not just to her presence, but to her predicament. Where others saw a quiet woman drifting through night shifts, he saw a suppressed variable in an operation that hadn't fully died, and he began watching the watchers, peeling back their layers. It was through him that Camila first learned the full shape of the net tightening around her. He handed her a printed list of external system pings that had bounced through the Hightower firewall over the past week. At first glance, the addresses were meaningless. But Camila recognized the pattern, the hand of Klein, the shape of an old protocol she'd written herself. Thomas didn't ask for her story. He offered no explanations for how he knew what he knew, but he did something far more valuable. He believed her. And belief, in a world full of doubt, was the first true weapon Camila had been handed in years. The moment arrived, not with a gunshot or a siren, but with a glitch. It was a small one, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. At exactly 3:42 a.m., during a routine sweep through Sublevel C, Camila's security badge refused to unlock Access Gate 17. The red light blinked once, twice, then froze. The system reset, but the gate remained locked. She swiped again. Nothing. Her badge had been deactivated. On paper, a simple tech hiccup. An error. A hardware delay. But Camila knew better. She had checked her credentials the night before, had tested the signal strength. Her badge wasn't effective. It had been flagged. And someone, somewhere, had manually revoked her access. The cameras above the gate swiveled slightly, as if adjusting to a better view. That alone told her this wasn't an IT issue. It was a trigger. She was being watched, and this was the event they had been waiting for. A forced error, a provocation. The next move was meant to be hers. Panic, confusion, anger. Any visible emotion that could justify containment. But she gave them nothing. She turned calmly, walked back toward the previous junction, and rerouted herself through the maintenance corridor. She didn't speak to the other guards. She didn't radio it in. Instead, she returned to her terminal, eyes flat, fingers moving fast across the outdated keyboard to cross-reference the personnel database. Her name was still listed, her position marked Active, Tier 2. But a subfield in her clearance file had changed. A hidden admin note she wasn't supposed to see now read, Ghost Tag Confirmed. Engage Tier 4 protocol upon secondary scan confirmation. That was all she needed to know. Tier 4 didn't mean warning. It meant isolation, detainment, and if needed, erasure. It was a language she had written herself once, buried inside a protocol designed for national emergencies. That it had now been applied to her meant her cover had truly collapsed. Someone high enough to override the local admin layer had pulled the trigger. It was over. The past she'd buried wasn't just rising. It had already wrapped itself around her, and now someone within the system had authorized her removal. Not as a rogue employee, but as an asset gone wrong. They didn't see her as a person anymore. They saw a risk that had awakened. She left her station calmly, took the north stairwell 2 floors down, and entered the biometric storage lab, a part of the facility no longer in use, now stacked with dormant hardware and dust-covered biometric readers. Thomas was already there. He didn't look surprised to see her. He simply handed her a single piece of paper. On it was a freeze frame from the security feed outside Access Gate 17. It showed her back, mid-turn, her hair pulled up just enough to expose the base of her neck. There, beneath the soft fabric of her uniform, a partial glimpse of the tattoo was visible. The spine-coded cipher. The very design she had once helped encrypt into her own skin for redundancy during a covert relay mission, an analog backup of sensitive key matrices that could not be stored digitally. That tattoo, a segmented array of geometric glyphs running the length of her spine, was both a key and a curse. Invisible to scanners, unless her body passed through a specific frequency of infrared and ultraviolet at once, a defense mechanism created to fool foreign agents and rogue AI systems. Only one agency had ever developed the tech to decode it. And now, that agency had found her again. Thomas didn't speak, but his expression had changed. There was awe there. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. He understood now why she moved the way she did, why she watched everything, why she didn't react like the others. He knew he wasn't standing in front of a simple night guard. He was standing in front of someone who had once carried national secrets beneath her skin. Someone who had walked away from a life that had been engineered, surveilled, manipulated, and finally discarded. She took the paper from him and folded it into a perfect square. No panic, no theatrics. But her next words were the first sign of the shift to come. They're activating the second phase. He nodded once, understanding the implication. Phase 2 meant active pursuit. It meant Ridgemont was no longer just a quiet town. It was now a staging ground. Somewhere beyond Hightower's walls, protocols were being triggered, systems redirected, and personnel assigned. The Watchers were now hunters. And she was their prey. But something else happened that night. Something neither of them could have predicted. At 4:03 a.m., just 20 minutes after the badge incident, the FBI's dormant server branch in Langley received a direct hit, a ping off an encrypted drive that hadn't been touched in 8 years. The ping came from an external audit tool embedded in the firewall at Hightower. It was an echo, a digital ghost, triggered by the tattoo scan. And attached to that ping, hidden in the metadata, was a fail-safe string written by Camila herself during Blackthorn's final days. A string that, once activated, automatically pulled archived files from the NSA's long-term cold vault and directed them to a secure repository tagged with her old operative name, Vanta 07. It wasn't just her identity that had resurfaced. It was everything she had once protected. The files began decrypting. Old case reports, failed missions, lists of operatives lost, internal disputes buried under layers of clearance. They streamed into the secure node one by one, and with each decrypted segment, a clearer picture of what had happened to Blackthorn came into view. And someone in Washington, someone high enough to notice, finally saw the full picture. Camila wasn't a rogue. She was the last survivor of a buried betrayal. And now, she wasn't running anymore. She was preparing to expose the truth. The shift in energy wasn't subtle. It arrived like a tremor beneath the surface, an unspoken change in posture among the guards, a stiffness in Mickey's tone, a new kind of stillness in the air of the Hightower facility. It began with a reassignment. Camila's patrol schedule was altered without explanation, consolidating her movement to the eastern corridors of the building. At first glance, it looked like a promotion. Shorter rounds, closer proximity to the main security hub, less foot traffic. But Camila knew better. The eastern wing had fewer blind spots, tighter surveillance angles, and double-paneled reinforced doors on every checkpoint. She wasn't being trusted more. She was being contained. Corridors that once allowed her to maneuver freely now felt like a narrowing cage. Someone was testing just how much she would tolerate before pushing back. The personnel around her changed too. Her regular partner was rotated out and replaced by an agent she didn't recognize. Agent Lorick, a man who didn't wear the same uniform as the other guards, who never removed his sunglasses even in the dim lighting, and who asked no questions but followed her too closely through every hallway. His badge was valid, his tone was professional, but his presence was surgical. Camila had seen this tactic before: embed the operative near the target, under the pretense of collaboration, then isolate, observe, and extract when the timing was right. The walls were closing in. Mickey, once oblivious and arrogant, had also changed. He stopped making eye contact with her in meetings. When she passed him in the hallway, he no longer cracked jokes or offered small talk. His voice had grown clipped, his footsteps hesitant. Camila understood that he'd been briefed, fed just enough information to fear her, but not enough to question orders. His silence wasn't discipline, it was guilt. He had become a participant in a system he couldn't fully comprehend, and it weighed on him like fog settling in his chest. Camila didn't blame him. People like Mickey weren't built to resist the machinery. They were made to follow protocols, even when those protocols turned against their own team. Meanwhile, Thomas Arledge grew harder to find. After the recognition moment in the biometric lab, his presence became increasingly intermittent. He left no paper trails, no sign-ins on the digital logbook. When Camila tried to trace his system usage, she found that his access had been restricted. His credentials rerouted through a proxy account housed under a cybersecurity firm registered in Estonia. She understood the message. He had gone dark, not out of abandonment, but necessity. He was moving in a layer above her now, clearing her path from the shadows. If he was still involved, it meant she wasn't entirely alone. But the system was escalating. Every move she made was now tracked more aggressively. Her digital keycard was scanned 12 times a shift instead of 3. The door delays grew longer. Her messages to Central Dispatch were monitored with time-stamped logs. Even her terminal access was capped. Sensitive folders grayed out, archive databases requiring multi-factor clearance she no longer possessed. She wasn't being fired. That would be too loud, too traceable. She was being erased, systematically, invisibly, neutralized without a word. And then came the drones. They arrived quietly, nestled into the corners of the facility's ceiling panels, disguised as updated smoke detectors. But Camila noticed them immediately. The whir was too smooth, the heat signature too high. They used optical tracking far beyond the budget of any civilian contractor. Someone had brought in federal surveillance under the pretense of infrastructure inspection. A silent infiltration wrapped in red tape. By the end of the week, Camila had counted 6 of them, 2 per wing, each programmed to sweep the corridors with irregular intervals to make passive identification scans every 42 seconds. It wasn't about security, it was about pressure, psychological friction, wear the subject down until they break. Camila didn't break, but she did shift. She activated her countermeasures. Carefully, subtly. She slipped a modified RFID loop into her badge, causing her system location to echo to different nodes every 15 minutes. She looped the drone feeds with pre-recorded footage. Seamless, 1-second delays that wouldn't trigger alerts unless reviewed by human eyes, which she knew no one at this stage would do. She rerouted her security reports through the redundant server in the cold storage wing, one of the few locations the drones had no visual access to. It was an old protocol, blind fire routing, developed by Blackthorn for internal leaks. Her past wasn't just haunting her now, it was saving her. Then came the confrontation. At 2:09 a.m., during her fourth patrol of the week, Camila was summoned to Conference Room 6A by internal dispatch. The message was direct and cold. Protocol review, supervisor present, immediate attendance required. She walked in without hesitation but fully prepared. Inside sat 3 men. One was Mickey, his face pale, his shoulders hunched. Another was a man she didn't recognize, thin, angular, in a tailored suit, clearly not from Hightower. The third was Agent Lorick, still in his mirrored shades. A laptop sat on the table, open, its screen frozen on an image. Her. From the badge reader feed, her back turned. The tattoo visible. "Ms. Rios," the man in the suit began, "we've been reviewing your activity logs. Some irregularities have surfaced." She said nothing. He continued, flipping through a dossier she hadn't seen before. Unauthorized movement, inconsistent keycard timestamps, systems access outside your clearance. And this. He rotated the screen slightly, zooming in on the tattoo. "We'd like to know," he said, calm and quiet, "what that means." Camila didn't answer. Because she didn't need to. The room was already compromised. Thomas had entered the system 20 minutes earlier, through a ghost port embedded in the facility's oldest comm server. The screen flickered. The drone overhead froze. Then the laptop shut down, replaced by a single phrase, in plain white text, "She is not alone." Camila stood slowly, her silence now a weapon. The suit reached for his phone. Mickey's mouth opened slightly, not in defiance but in understanding. He finally saw it, the woman they had all dismissed, the woman who had once been invisible. She had just become unstoppable. The silence in the room after the screen went black was not empty. It pulsed, thick with unspoken awareness, like the moment before a storm breaks through a fragile sky. The phrase, "she is not alone," lingered like a flare across their retinas. Agent Lorick's hand twitched toward his waist, but Camila didn't flinch. She had measured this moment for weeks. This was no longer a reaction. This was initiation. She stepped forward, her voice calm, firm, unshaken by their authority. For the first time since walking into Hightower, she spoke more than protocol. Her words, simple but direct, cut through the tension, like wire through fog. "You were told I was an anomaly. You were wrong." She didn't wait for a response. She slid a small device from her pocket, a biometric reader, repurposed and altered with a firmware she had developed in the field. Before any of them could stop her, she pressed her thumb to the sensor. The device blinked once, then projected a holo display onto the tabletop, an encrypted interface that bypassed the facility's internal security grid and launched directly into the dormant ColdNet channel embedded in the walls of the now-defunct Blackthorn branch. Only 6 devices like it ever existed. The last time any of them were used, half a dozen deep-state operations collapsed within 24 hours. The screen filled with a cascade of data, operation logs, biometric profiles, kill orders, declassified missions, and asset disposal reports, all tied to the now acknowledged but still publicly denied Blackthorn program. Camila's designation appeared at the top, Vante 07, status abandoned. Underneath her profile were time-stamped mission summaries from 8 countries, encrypted communications flagged under joint clearance by 3 agencies, and incident reports that contradicted official accounts of high-level foreign engagements. The man in the suit paled. Camila turned her attention to him fully for the first time. "You're not looking at a mistake," she said. "You're looking at a cover-up, a program you thought was buried, a survivor you assumed was neutralized. I am the record. And the record doesn't forget." Mickey said nothing, but his eyes were wide now, not with fear but with awe. For months, he had spoken over her, around her, dismissed her presence like background noise. Now he understood the scope of what he had ignored. The quiet one in the back wasn't just a veteran of a forgotten program. She was the backbone of it, a construct of training, data, and precision. The very existence of Blackthorn had depended on operatives like her, unseen, underestimated, untraceable. But Camila didn't care for their reactions. She wasn't here for validation, she was here for control. She navigated through the terminal, bypassing encryption walls with muscle memory, accessing the dormant contingency protocols still buried in the cold storage layer of the Blackthorn database. These were tools meant to be used in the event of systemic collapse: satellite scramblers, secure emergency beacons, contact protocols for surviving operatives, dead drop locations globally coordinated by an AI framework long since believed offline. She triggered a single command: Expose +1. A flash pulse rippled through the projection, and then the screen lit with a new panel: names, photos, and current locations of operatives believed dead. Silent agents like her, lost in the wash of politics and betrayal, resurfaced through one command. Not just one, dozens. This was no longer about survival. It was resurrection. Camila had waited, watched, endured. She had let herself be erased, let herself disappear to test the scope of what remained. And now she saw it all clearly. Blackthorn had never truly died. It had been paused, entombed in bureaucracy, sealed away because too many men in power feared what it represented. Autonomous intelligence built on moral clarity, on the power of operatives who chose when to act, not just when ordered. She hadn't just been part of it, she had become its last living code. The suit tried to regain footing. He stammered about chain of command, breach of protocol, unauthorized system activation. Camila shut him down with a single statement: This entire building is now running on borrowed software. Yours. I built it. You didn't even bother to change the core logic. I've been 6 steps ahead since you scanned the back of my neck. She turned to Mickey, who was frozen, lips parted, processing the seismic shift in his understanding of who he'd been working beside. You always said I didn't have the presence for leadership, she said quietly. Maybe now you see what silence builds. And then, finally, to Lorik, who had stood still, unreadable. If you were sent to escort me, she said, do it, but I suggest you think carefully. Because right now, I can detonate your cover with 3 lines of code. Lorik didn't move. Because he knew she wasn't bluffing. She stepped back, holoscreen fading. Around them, the room felt smaller, denser. The air carried weight. Camila had changed the dynamic permanently, not by drawing blood or pulling rank, but by doing what none of them had expected. She had shown them the truth. And truth, delivered in silence and precision, was the sharpest blade of all. This was her moment, not of vengeance, but declaration. Camila Rios, once written off as background, had just redrawn the lines of power. And she was just getting started. In the 72 hours that followed the confrontation in Conference Room 6A, the world as Camila had known it, or rather, as it had chosen to ignore her, began to buckle under the weight of long-buried truths. What began as a silent warning, a single decrypted file dropped into a dormant node, exploded into a cascading exposure of systemic deception. The Blackthorn archives, once thought destroyed or fragmented beyond recovery, had been resurrected by Camila's fingerprint and uploaded through ghost ports to a private network monitored by a failsafe AI originally intended for last resort information recovery. It was a mechanism Camila herself had helped design nearly a decade earlier, never expecting to use it, but always knowing she might need to. That time had come, and it did not go unnoticed. By the morning of the 3rd day, 2 major federal systems began issuing formal requests for encryption keys that hadn't been circulated since the final disbandment order of Blackthorn. The requests came from within the FBI's Behavioral Science Division and a task force buried under Homeland Cyber Defense, both redacted beyond recognition in most public databases. Camila watched it unfold from a nondescript apartment on the edge of Ridgemont, her burner laptop tethered to a secure satellite signal bouncing through layers of onion-routed decoys. Her hands never trembled, her eyes never left the screen. This wasn't vengeance, it was confirmation. For the first time in years, people in power were forced to acknowledge she existed, not as a ghost, but as a witness. The public exposure came at 9:12 a.m. on a Wednesday. It started with a leak. A retired journalist named Victor Brantley, known for his decades-old investigations into military overreach, received a package on his doorstep. No return address. Inside, a drive, an envelope, and a printed photo of the tattoo on Camila's spine with the handwritten message, "Start here." Within that drive were partial logs of Operation Halberd, the failed extraction that left Camila presumed dead, along with classified orders that contradicted every official report issued after the mission collapsed. Included were redacted communication transcripts implicating senior government officials in an orchestrated effort to eliminate field agents who had become inconvenient due to what internal memos referred to as moral volatility. Camila wasn't just a survivor. She was proof of a system willing to erase its best operatives to protect its weakest leaders. Brantley, though semi-retired, wasted no time. He contacted his former editors, looped in independent media networks, and by midday, 3 major outlets had published partial documents under emergency editorial clauses. Government spokespeople scrambled to issue denials, but the documents kept coming, more each hour, feeding a digital thread now followed by millions. Former operatives, some long silent, some disgraced by old cover stories, began to speak anonymously, validating names, mission code names, command structures. Camila's identity, once reduced to, quote, guard number 514, now carried weight as Agent Vanta AO7, the keystone in an unthinkable betrayal spanning years, departments, and continents. At Hightower, chaos bloomed beneath the sterile white walls, security protocols shifted, internal investigations were launched. Mickey was pulled into back-to-back briefings, his initial ignorance confirmed, but his recent silence questioned. The man in the suit, never named but increasingly identified by leaked photos, vanished from the facility, his credentials purged from the system. Agent Lorick, who had remained still during Camila's declaration, submitted an official report that confirmed her clearance was not only valid, but elevated beyond current facility parameters. That line, when made public, hit the system like a hammer. Someone high up had tampered with her access to bury her identity, and someone even higher had overridden that tampering to reinstate it. But perhaps the most unexpected wave came from the public itself. Comments flooded online threads, strangers defending Camila's composure, ex-military praising her restraint, survivors of systemic abuse calling her a symbol of what it meant to fight quietly until the truth could no longer be denied. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers through every platform. Hashtag the spine code, hashtag she was the system, #Vanta07. It wasn't just recognition. It was vindication, carried not through polished speeches or orchestrated PR campaigns, but through evidence, reputation, and the unwavering precision of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to command the room. Meanwhile, Thomas Arledge emerged from the shadows, not to take credit, but to corroborate. In a video uploaded anonymously to a cybersecurity forum, his voice filtered through a modulator. He confirmed Camila's identity and detailed his own encounter with the buried surveillance patterns, the drone infiltration, and the systematic attempt to erase her from existence. He didn't reveal his face. He didn't need to. The timestamps, system IDs, and footage embedded in the video were irrefutable. The world saw what the system hadn't: a woman written off as invisible, now unmistakably seen. Government agencies began issuing inquiries, some performative, others panicked. Legal teams requested classified briefings. Whistleblower protections were suddenly extended retroactively to all agents named in the Blackthorn revival logs. Camila, through it all, remained quiet, not because she feared what would come next, but because she had no need to speak louder. Her life was now its own message. At last, the FBI contacted her directly. A formal request, delivered through encrypted channels, asked for a meeting. Not a detainment. Not an interrogation. A request. For consultation. They wanted her insight, her memory, her map of the truth. Camila considered it from her seat by the window, sunlight glinting faintly off the edge of her laptop. For years she had been hunted, doubted, erased. And now the very people who once pretended she didn't exist were asking her to guide them through the wreckage. She didn't smile. But the storm behind her eyes softened, because she understood something they were only just beginning to realize. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands in the doorway, calm and ready, with a scar down its spine and a name the world will never forget. In the days that followed the revelation, Ridgemont seemed to hum with a strange and quiet awareness. The town that had once dismissed Camila Rios as a night guard with no voice, no story, no relevance, now existed in a kind of suspended acknowledgement. An unspoken reverence that passed through people's glances, through awkward silences at cafes, through the nervous stiffness in Mickey's shoulders as he handed in his resignation without fanfare. His departure was quiet, almost as if he hoped it would go unnoticed. But Camila saw him that final evening as he passed through the lobby with a cardboard box filled with personal items, a man newly aware of his own blindness. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. He had already said what mattered most in the silence that followed the truth. Nothing, because there was nothing he could say to undo what he had once laughed at, questioned, minimized. The Hightower facility began a swift restructuring. A federal compliance task force took over, sweeping the building's systems for unauthorized surveillance layers, quietly retiring every drone that had been installed under the false inspection order. A new internal policy was enacted, ironically drafted in part from a procedural white paper Camila had authored years ago under a pseudonym, back when she believed that covert intelligence could be both ethical and effective. Her fingerprints were everywhere now, not hidden in the background, but embedded into the very protocols they were rediscovering. She watched as supervisors scurried to align themselves with whatever narrative would save their reputations. The man in the suit never returned, his name never disclosed, but whispers in the encrypted forums hinted he had been pulled into a black chamber review and reassigned, his clearance reduced, his influence dissolved, a ghost in the bureaucratic machine that had once given him power over lives like hers. More former Blackthorn operatives emerged in the weeks that followed, not in the literal sense, not parading in front of cameras, but reaching out through dead channels, reactivating burner relays, sending her pings from obscure corners of the world. Short messages, fragments. You made it. They'll listen now. Ready to surface, Camila compiled each message into a digital codex, an informal roll call of the erased, the forgotten, the loyal. They had all paid the price for surviving a war of silence, and now, finally, they were finding each other again. Camila herself was approached formally by the FBI's Internal Integrity Division. This time, it wasn't under suspicion or surveillance. It was with the reverence of someone who knew she'd held onto secrets not to harm, but to protect. She declined most interviews, turned down media offers, and ignored requests for a memoir. Her story wasn't for entertainment. It had already cost too much to become fodder for profit. Instead, she agreed to testify, once in closed session, providing sworn documentation of Blackthorn's final operations, its disbandment, and the sabotage that led to her disappearance. Her testimony didn't indict names. It indicted systems, structures that made it possible for loyalty to be weaponized against itself, for silence to become a death sentence, for integrity to be labeled insubordination. Some people tried to frame her as a hero, others, more cynical, called her a relic of a bygone era. But she rejected both titles. She wasn't a symbol. She was a survivor of deliberate forgetting. And now that she had been remembered, she chose to keep moving. Ridgemont's local paper published a single article about her. Nothing flashy. A column buried between a community notice and a school board update. It read simply, "Former Hightower guard revealed to be former intelligence operative." Local officials declined comment. Neighbors expressed surprise and admiration, but that article was clipped and shared thousands of times across forums, blogs, and private military networks. Because those who knew what it meant understood that it wasn't about exposure, it was about endurance. Even Mickey, from wherever he had gone, left a note tucked under the desk drawer she once used. It had only 2 words. "I'm sorry." Camila didn't need the apology, but she kept the note anyway, not as a token of forgiveness, but as proof that even small minds could wake up when shaken hard enough by the truth. Her own apartment remained sparse. She kept only what she needed. The burner laptop was replaced with a clean one, air-gapped from the outside world. She didn't fear being found. Not anymore. But old habits had kept her alive. And now, those habits would help others who were still in hiding, still hoping for one voice loud enough to make a breach in the silence. Camila had become that breach. She wasn't interested in returning to fieldwork. She didn't want vengeance. She didn't want a job title or an official reinstatement. What she wanted, what she demanded in her quiet, resolute way, was acknowledgement, not of her pain, but of her presence, that she had been there, that she had endured, that she had mattered, even when no one was watching. Her days became quieter again, but not the same kind of quiet she once knew. This silence didn't come from erasure. It came from completion, from the knowledge that she had not only survived, but changed the narrative left behind her. The woman who had once stood in the background of fluorescent-lit corridors now walked freely under open skies, no longer haunted by the need to prove herself, no longer burdened by the fear of being forgotten. The world had tried to overwrite her, and she had written herself back in. Camila Rios never returned to the corridors of power. She didn't take the invitation to consult for the internal intelligence reform committees. Nor did she accept the secure line offered by the newly appointed director of operations. She didn't go on speaking tours or accept honorary medals, or let herself become the central figure in someone else's narrative. What she did, quietly, steadily, and without fanfare, was create space. In the months that followed the revelation, after the files were decrypted and the world finally saw her for who she was, Camila began building a network, not a new Blackthorn, not a militarized cell or retaliatory movement, but a sanctuary of voices, survivors of covert betrayal, operatives who had been orphaned by systems that used them until they no longer fit the doctrine, whistleblowers too cautious to speak publicly, but too honorable to stay silent. She didn't recruit them, she didn't call it a group. It wasn't a brand, a platform, or a resistance. It was simply connection, threaded through encrypted messages, anonymized portals, shared resources, a decentralized alliance of those who understood what it meant to serve in the shadows and be punished for remembering the light. The FBI's Internal Integrity Task Force eventually released a redacted public statement, confirming, quote, inconsistencies in the historical documentation and closure of several now defunct operational divisions, with no direct mention of Blackthorn. But the subtext was clear to those who read it carefully. The spine code tattoo had become its own kind of watermark, a symbol for those who had been branded not by rank or glory, but by secrecy and survival. Within months, a small civilian-run nonprofit emerged, called the Seventh Glyph, named in tribute to Camila's designation. Its mission was simple: to advocate for former intelligence assets who had been abandoned, to review denied veterans' benefits claims from covert units, and to help erase the silence around post-operational trauma and betrayal. Camila never publicly aligned herself with the organization. She sent no statements. She declined every offer to appear on their advisory board. But behind the firewall of their servers, there was one IP address that would occasionally appear late at night, quietly leaving patches to fix security bugs, donating server space, and uploading rare decryption templates that let certain files surface without triggering internal agency alerts. Her influence ran like current through the veins of the movement, not overt, but vital. Everyone who knew understood. Those who didn't need to. On a broader scale, institutions began shifting, though slowly, and with all the friction of systems unaccustomed to accountability. Clearance protocols were revised. Termination procedures were put under new oversight. Decommissioned agents were offered post-service psychological reviews and exit briefings that no longer dismissed their human worth. Training manuals at 3 major intelligence academies added a single required reading, a case study about a facility guard whose silence unraveled a buried chapter of national intelligence history. They didn't use her name in the study, but they referenced her designation, Vanteo 7, and they included a still image of the tattoo, coded and radiant in a dim corridor. That image, once used to mark her for deletion, had become a symbol of reform. Online, her story became a point of convergence for discussions far beyond the intelligence community. Advocacy groups quoted her case in conversations about whistleblower protections. Academics used her as a case study in ethics courses about loyalty and institutional failure. Artists began designing murals, symbolic pieces, and graphic novels that reimagined her arc, not for profit, but for resonance. For those who had ever been dismissed, minimized, or misidentified, she was more than a spy. She was a mirror, a reminder that strength isn't always loud, and sometimes the quietest presence carries the most seismic weight. Even in Ridgemont, where the story had started as a local whisper, things had changed. The residents, once oblivious or skeptical, now spoke of her name with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes and scholars. Young women who passed by the Hightower facility, now under entirely new leadership, would glance at the gate with curiosity, their minds shifting at the idea that someone who looked like them, someone who stood where no one expected power to be, had reshaped an entire system. Teachers referenced her during lessons about modern history. Librarians stocked the declassified hearing transcripts next to biographies of revolutionaries. Her silence had never meant nothing. It had been preparation. But what truly endured was the cultural shift she sparked. People began to look differently at the overlooked. The soft-spoken janitor, the tired nurse, the quiet veteran working as a delivery driver. A new cultural respect emerged, a hesitancy to assume, a sharper awareness that behind every calm presence might be a history the world never bothered to learn. It wasn't just about spies and government corruption. It was about who we choose to notice, about how often we mistake quiet for weakness, resilience for irrelevance. Camila never tried to reclaim her old life. It was never about going back. It was about what could be built from the ashes. She spent her mornings walking the forest trails just outside town, her spine upright beneath a simple hoodie, her eyes always alert but no longer hunted. Sometimes she would pause by a tree and close her eyes, breathing in the world she had helped preserve, not with a gun, not with glory, but with the conviction to remain, to endure, to outlast the forgetting. And far away, in rooms where decisions were once made in secrecy and arrogance, her name, whispered or typed, analyzed or encrypted, remained as a quiet boundary, a reminder to those in power that some ghosts cannot be buried and some codes are never broken. Autumn arrived in Ridgemont with a softness that Camila hadn't felt in years. The trees lining the edge of the town wore their change like old wisdom, shifting from green to gold to rust, as if time were no longer something to outrun, but something to listen to. For the first time in over a decade, she didn't move through the world with rehearsed caution or back-facing awareness. She didn't check her rearview mirror 3 times, or map out her exits before entering a store. She still noticed everything, of course. Old habits were not easily erased, but there was a different kind of alertness now, one rooted in permission rather than survival. She was no longer hunted, erased, or forgotten. She was present. Fully. On a Thursday afternoon, as the sun spilled over the cracked sidewalk near Langston Park, she stopped by a small bookstore that had once ignored her completely. Now, it held a quiet display in the non-fiction aisle. Tucked between institutional memoirs and policy reviews was a slim volume titled Forgotten Agents, A History of Blackthorn. The cover was unassuming, just a silhouette standing at the edge of a concrete hallway, but she recognized the photo. It was her. The grainy still from a hallway camera on her second shift at Hightower, captured just before everything began unraveling. She didn't flinch at the sight. She simply stood there for a moment, absorbing it like someone looking at a distant memory from the outside in. A clerk, maybe 22, with a buzz cut and an armful of restocks, paused near her and said quietly, "That story changed how I look at everyone who walks in here." He didn't say it to flatter her, he didn't even know it was her, and that made it mean more than he'd ever realize. Later that week, she received a message through one of the secure relay systems she still kept online, not out of fear, but for those who still needed the line. It was from Lorik. Not long, not dramatic, just a simple update. He was out, retired, living somewhere near the Nevada border, working with an old Blackthorn contact to establish a small training program for field readiness in post-service life. He ended the message with, "You made the silence mean something. Thought you should know." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. They had spoken all they needed to speak that night, when he didn't pull his weapon, when he let her speak freely, when he stood still and listened without orders. Camila also received word from Mickey, not through a letter this time, but through a community bulletin that listed him as a volunteer mentor for local youth programs. There, in black ink, under a small photo of him with a football tucked under one arm, was a single sentence. Believes in second chances because he witnessed one up close. She didn't attend the programs. She didn't contact him. But she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that some people really could change, that growth didn't always need to be loud to be real. She continued to walk the trails, read military history, meditate with a discipline born not from trend but from need. Her health stabilized, her breathing deepened, her sleep came more easily. She had traded nightmares for dreams, not always gentle, but always hers. She began sketching again too, not schematics or tactical plans, but images of rivers, hands, windows. Things that held meaning without mission, things that reminded her the world was still worth observing without needing to fix it. The world moved on without her, but it did so differently now. Her legacy wasn't framed in victory speeches or newspaper headlines. It was more subtle, reflected in the way young security applicants were no longer dismissed for being quiet, or how former agents were now asked what they needed after decommissioning rather than what they could still offer. The impact wasn't loud, but it lasted. Like a code etched into the foundation of something bigger than her, built by her silence, her endurance, her unwavering truth. Camila never sought recognition, but she received something rarer. She became a reason someone else believed they weren't alone. And that was more than enough. Camila had lived most of her adult life, preparing for the moment she might have to vanish again. It was a mindset drilled deep into her muscles, her instincts, her breath. For years, every movement was calculated not only for efficiency, but for retreat, every room mentally mapped for escape. But now, as winter approached and the town of Ridgemont shifted into its usual quiet, she found herself doing something strange, staying. Not hiding. Not watching from the margins. Staying. She renewed her lease without hesitation. She left the curtains open in the morning. She walked into town without a cap drawn over her eyes. The woman who had once been trained to move through cities like wind through leaves had begun taking up space in a life she'd built. Not one handed to her by a handler. Not one she had to construct from lies, but one she had quietly chosen. The apartment she occupied no longer felt like a temporary shelter or a waiting room between missions. She bought a plant. Just one. A small fern that sat on her windowsill. She didn't give it a name. She didn't speak to it like some do. She simply watered it every few days, watched it stretch toward the sun, and realized in some strange way she understood it. Something once kept in shadow now beginning to unfurl, cautiously, with intention. On her desk sat the remains of her old life, a small, secure drive holding the entirety of the Blackthorn archives she had helped preserve, now locked away in triple-layered encryption. She hadn't opened it since the hearing. She didn't need to. It wasn't her burden anymore. It was a record, not a wound. One afternoon, while walking the outer perimeter of the park trail she favored, Camila passed a group of teenagers practicing self-defense drills under the guidance of a local instructor. She watched from a distance for a while, not as a critic, not even as a mentor, but as someone who simply understood the language of movement. One girl caught her attention. Small, wiry, awkward in her footing, but determined. When she stumbled during a rotation and fell hard onto the gravel, the others laughed, but she stood up without a word and got back into position. That small act sent a memory through Camilla's mind, not of war, not of espionage, but of her own beginning, back when her silence had been mistaken for uncertainty rather than control. She smiled faintly and walked on, the sound of footsteps behind her fading. Letters began to arrive more frequently now, routed through the secure network. Not emergencies, not desperate cries for help, just quiet acknowledgments. I read about you. Your story found me. I'm still here. They weren't looking for a savior. They weren't asking for guidance. They just wanted to be seen. Camila read each message and stored them with care. She never replied in length, but she always sent a single character back. 7. It was enough. Those who knew, understood. She never pursued revenge against those who wronged her. The man in the suit who tried to erase her from the system, the agents who stood by while her status was stripped, the supervisors who mocked her presence behind closed doors, they had all received their own form of exposure. Some were reassigned, some disappeared from public life. 1 or 2 issued anonymous statements that never reached her desk. But Camila didn't need apologies. She didn't need headlines. The power had shifted long ago, not when they fell, but when she rose without needing to destroy them. There were still quiet nights where the weight of her past returned, not as terror, but as memory, faces long gone, missions that still lived in the edges of her mind. But even in those moments, she found peace, not in forgetting, but in carrying it differently. It no longer bent her spine. It no longer stole her breath. It simply walked beside her, a companion she had made peace with, like a shadow that had finally learned to match her stride. Camila Rios was no longer a ghost in the system. She was its reckoning. Winter in Ridgemont had always arrived like a whispered truth, slow and subtle, until the air itself felt thinner and the sky paled into shades of steel. Camila welcomed the cold not as a discomfort, but as a mirror. There was a clarity to it, a starkness that stripped away the unnecessary. The city grew quieter in December. People stayed inside. The chatter thinned. The world slowed down. And in that stillness, she found the space she hadn't realized she was waiting for, the space to exist, finally, without needing to prove or protect anything. She still woke early, just after 5, not because she feared an ambush or surveillance, but because old rhythms were hard to break. She used the extra hours to write, not reports or mission logs, but reflections, short entries handwritten in a journal bound in worn leather, a gift from a librarian who once recognized her from a grainy interview clip and left it anonymously on her doorstep. In those pages, Camila didn't recount operations or betrayals. She didn't name names or dwell on revenge. Instead, she wrote about the texture of silence, the way a crowd moves when they think no one is watching, the strange and lovely ritual of peeling an orange in total solitude. She wrote about being a woman in a world that prefers its heroes loud and its threats visible. And she wrote about choice, the radical, defiant power of choosing stillness over chaos, quiet over recognition. She never expected the journal to become anything more than a personal archive, but something inside her wanted it recorded. Not for legacy, but for continuity. So that if someone else, years from now, found themselves erased or doubted or dismissed, they'd see that survival isn't always loud, and truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. On the first snowfall of the season, she walked down to the old bridge by the Western Trail, a place she had once surveyed for risk but now simply visited for peace. There were boot prints already in the snow, some human, some canine. Life moved on. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere near the park. Camila stood at the edge of the water, the cold wind rushing against her scarf, and allowed herself the rare luxury of being unguarded. In that moment, she wasn't an agent, wasn't a warning, wasn't a legend. She was just a woman with her hands in her pockets and a past that no longer held her hostage. Her phone buzzed gently in her coat pocket, a discreet signal, routed through a secure relay. She checked it out of habit more than urgency. A message blinked on screen, unsigned as always. "We've started it. Small, but steady. They're listening now. Thank you." She deleted the message. Not from paranoia, but from finality. The work had already passed beyond her hands. Others had picked it up. The story was no longer hers alone. It had spread into corners she would never walk, voices she would never hear, policies she would never write. And that was exactly how it should be. The girl from the park, the one who had fallen during training, sent a letter through the bookstore. The clerk passed it along without comment, just a nod. Inside was a simple folded sheet, lined in pencil. "I didn't quit. They told me you were real. If you ever want to teach again, even once, I'd be there." Camila tucked it into her journal. She didn't decide then. She didn't need to. The offer was enough. The fact that someone, somewhere, was watching her story not as a spectacle, but as a seed, that meant more than any agency ever could. As winter deepened, headlines about corruption gave way to other news. The media moved on, as it always did. But in certain circles, covert groups, justice movements, secure briefings, her name remained. Sometimes spoken, sometimes just hinted at. Not as a warning, not even as a myth, but as a reminder that systems forget people, but people do not forget the feeling of injustice. Her story became a quiet fire passed from hand to hand, warming the places the spotlight never reaches. A code etched not in ink, but in impact. Camila eventually took a part-time role at a local archive, cataloging old government documents donated to the community museum. No one there knew her past. They just knew she worked quietly, methodically, and always asked the right questions when something seemed out of place. Her life didn't need a stage. It needed a rhythm. And she had found one. When asked one afternoon by a curious intern what she had done before this, Camila smiled, paused, and said, "Security." The girl nodded, satisfied with the answer, and Camila returned to filing without offering more. Because it was true. She had kept people safe, not in the way anyone expected, but in the way that mattered most. At night, she sometimes sat near the window, watching snow settle on the pavement, the world wrapped in white, muted and slow. And in those hours, she understood that survival had never been her legacy. Visibility wasn't the victory. The real triumph was endurance, the ability to move through every attempt to erase her and still choose to be whole, still choose to build, still choose to stand. They had laughed when she applied for security. Now they spoke her name with quiet reverence. And somewhere in the silence that followed, Camila Rios breathed deeply, at peace. Not because the world finally saw her, but because she no longer needed it to. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.